Hi everyone. This week you're going through the first chapter of the content and you're learning what gender means. And I thought it would be appropriate for us to define what gender and communication actually is so you have some idea of what the subject of this class really is. So, first thing I want you to think about the basic premise for the content here is that gender is something that's communicated. It's not physiological. It's Gender is a social construct. You're going to read about that in the next couple pages. And because it's a social construct, it has to be communicated. It can't exist in anything other than communications. Now, might say, wait, but April, don't I express my gender with the way I dress, not just the way I talk and the kinds of choices I make and all of that? Yes, you do. Those are all acts of communication as well. We'll talk about that later, but the way you're dressed, the way you present yourself, your all kinds of other nonverbals, in addition to the way you speak and the kinds of things you say. Your gender is a presentation is about all of that, right? So gender is something that we communicate, and we also read. That's how, probably most of us aren't like sitting there trying to figure out someone else's gender. It's probably very latent and unconscious, but we do read other people through that same lens of their expression of their communication. So gender is an expression, and an expression is by definition communication. So gender only exists in communication. It's not biological. Next week we could talk about, maybe for some people it has a biological component, but for right now we're going to think of it as a social construct, which means it exists in communication, exists because culture said that's the way it is. So that's one of the basic principles for this class. And I just said gender is cultural, so it's really important to think about your expression of gender, masculine, feminine, somewhere in between, somewhere on that scale. Maybe it changes from day to day, maybe it changes from location to location. That's very cultural. It's innate in you, right? But it's also taught to you by your culture. So those two things seem like the opposite, and kind of in a way they are. They're all kind of muddled up in there together, and then the person gets there and they express their gender, right? A combination of what feels good to me and what I was taught should feel good, and then how much of that clashed together, and then what ended up coming out of me. That's what I ended up expressing up that day. That's my expression. And culture really teaches us, again, because gender is a social construct, part of that social construct is culture tells us what quote unquote gender. I actually think that gender is, I always say gender, you can't pin it down. It moves the moment you try to pin it down. It's hard to define, right? Um, Gender changes from culture to culture because we were taught what being masculine means in one culture and being feminine means in that same culture. And in some cultures, they allow for more variation than others. And you can tell gender has to be a social construct, or it would not be different from culture to culture. If gender was biological, solely biological anyway, I mean, maybe there's some biological components, but if gender was only biological and not a social construct, it wouldn't change from culture to culture. And you need to look no further than knowing that it's American culture has certain ideas about masculinity and femininity, and which are different than, say, Mexican culture, which is much different than, say, Australian culture or Japanese culture. Every culture has a different idea of what gender means and what masculine and feminine mean, and how much freedom people get. That it is a social construct. It's created by society, it's created by culture. And then we as individuals, consciously or unconsciously, act it out. We express it. And we may have put more or less thought into it. Maybe it just comes innately to us. Maybe we've made some conscious choices. It's very, very personal. Remember that gender is very, very personal. So that, which leads me to my next point. There's a big but here. There are lots of people, maybe if we counted, more people than not, don't fit perfectly into those categories of whatever their particular culture told them gender is supposed to be. Because I'm here to destroy your box a little bit about it's not that people should be a certain way. It's that we tend to associate certain behaviors with certain types of gender expression. So we tend to associate being more direct with being a more masculine behavior. But that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. That's just a cultural ideal that we've come up with. So it's totally okay. Many, if not most people, don't fit perfect into those discrete categories, and that's good. It's probably better to have that type of variety. And there's going to be people who sometimes they fit really strongly into one category and then they might change over the course of time, or maybe they have a little bit of qualities from more than one category. All of that's okay, which that's probably the most common in a lot of ways anyway. So when you really start thinking about it, and so we're going to keep talking about that, but in this class, we're going to define what American culture typically sees as masculinity and femininity, and then we're going to talk about what problems does that raise. If men can't cry, what problems does that raise? That's a trap. It's a problem. Because our culture says that men shouldn't be emotional. The flip side of that would be that that American culture says women are overly emotional. Well, there's a trap there too. There's a stereotype in that. That's the big trap too. So we'll talk about what some of those common associations that we might have with gender are, and then we're going to try to bust a lot of them up and try to come to the conclusion that, most of us don't fit into these discrete categories, but we still read people that way. So we need to be aware of those behaviors, and we need to be self-reflective about ourselves and reflective about others. Gender is very, very personal. Like I said, it's part of who you are, sort of like you, and you might even argue that it's a personality trait. It's part of who you are. It's innate. And for a lot of people, it's really, oh, there it went. Sorry, my video glitched out. For a lot of people, it's very near and dear, close to their heart. Probably for most people, actually. Just not everyone's had to do the work to unpack it. So it's part of who you are. It's a trait about more like your expression. Okay. And again, you express your gender through your communication, how you talk, what you choose to say, the kinds of things that you prefer to do, the way you prefer to speak, the way you act, your nonverbals, your presence in a room, the amount of space you take up. Masculine communicators tend to take up more space than feminine communicators. We'll talk about how that's linked in with power, all kinds of things like that. And then that's how you read other people too. And we'll talk about how sometimes reading other people can change your opinion of them. For example, women tend to be American culture tends to say that women should be less direct, feminine communicators should be less direct. Well, for a female-bodied person to show up to something and be pretty direct, oftentimes there's a push against that. The people are reading her as being a word that I'm not going to say in the video. This is seen as a negative thing, even though really, if we take a step back, that shouldn't be a problem at all. So for a female to be direct, that's just one of many examples about why it's important to see how we read gender for people. It's a big part of this class. Okay, and to wrap it all up, this is a super useful information for you. It can help you get insight into yourself and others, which is always really useful, right? It can change the way you interact and improve your interactions with other people. It can build your understanding on a multitude of levels, probably about a whole bunch of things you haven't even thought of yet. And ultimately, the real point is to make you a more effective communicator, and for you to be able to spot the stuff that, spot the things that are happening around you, good, bad, or indifferent. It's not about judgment. It's just being a more effective communicator and being able to really understand where people are coming from and be able to effectively handle yourself in any situation. So super interesting content, and I just wanted to provide you a little bit of a glimpse into our future here as we learn about gender and communication.